Most of us start composting with the best intentions but the wrong expectations. You save your vegetable peelings, your coffee grounds, and your eggshells, and you walk them out to a designated spot in the yard. You dump them on top of a pile of dry leaves, maybe give it a half-hearted stir with a pitchfork, and then you wait. You have been told that nature takes its time, and that decomposition is a slow, passive process that just happens if you leave it alone long enough. So you leave it alone. You wait through the fall, and you wait through the winter, expecting that when spring arrives, you will lift that bin or turn that pile and find rich, dark earth ready for your garden beds. But that is rarely what happens. Instead, you find a slimy, anaerobic mess at the bottom that smells like rot. Or you find a dry, dusty stack of leaves that hasn't broken down at all. You can still read the newsprint on the paper you shredded last October. You can still identify the avocado skins and the corn cobs. It feels like a failure. You assume you did something wrong, or that you just don't have the magic touch that other gardeners seem to possess. You end up buying bags of soil from the garden center anyway, because your pile didn't deliver when you needed it. I spent years doing exactly this, treating my compost pile like a slow-motion garbage disposal, rather than a biological reactor. I thought I was making soil, but I was really just hoarding trash. It took me a long time to realize that time alone does not create compost. Management does. And once I decided to stop guessing and actually test the different ways to break this material down, the difference wasn't just in the quality of the soil. It was in the clock. When you rely on passive decomposition, you are essentially gambling with your garden's fertility. You are hoping the temperature stays right, hoping the moisture levels balance themselves, and hoping the microbes show up on their own schedule. But hope is not a system. I realized that if I wanted to stop buying fertilizer and soil amendments, I had to stop treating my compost pile like a landfill and start treating it like a biological process. The failure wasn't personal, it was procedural. I had been using the cold and slow method by default because that's what everyone said was easiest. But easy on the front end often means useless on the back end. I wanted to know the truth about the trade-offs, so I set up a test. I didn't just want to read about it, I wanted to see the results in my own yard, with my own climate and my own waste stream. I designated 6 distinct zones to test the most common methods available to a standard homeowner. I looked at the passive cold bin, the open pile, the tumbling batch system, the trench method, vermicomposting with worms, and finally, the hot active pile. I used the same feedstock for all of them: leaves from the maple trees, grass clippings, kitchen scraps, and cardboard. The goal wasn't to find the best one, because best is subjective. The goal was to find the one that was predictable. I needed to know which method would give me finished product when I was ready to plant. Not 6 months too late. This was about moving from a scavenger mindset to a producer mindset. The first 2 methods I tested are what I call the cold approaches, which is just a polite way of saying the ignore it approaches. These are the standard plastic bin you get from the municipality and the open wire or pallet bay in the back corner of the yard. The appeal here is obvious. It requires 0 labor. You just walk out, lift the lid, or toss the bucket over the fence and walk away. It feels efficient because it demands nothing from you on a Tuesday night when you are tired. I ran these simultaneously, filling them with the standard mix of kitchen scraps and yard waste as it became available, mimicking the way a normal household operates. There was no measuring, no turning, and no temperature checking. I just let them sit. 6 months later, I went to harvest. The results were sobering. In the black plastic bin, the material hadn't really composted. It had mummified. The dry leaves on top were brittle and unchanged. The kitchen scraps in the middle were a slimy, compressed layer of sludge that had gone anaerobic because no air could get to it. It smelled sour, like vinegar and rot. It wasn't soil. It was preserved garbage. The open wire pile fared slightly better because it had air, but without mass and heat, it was just a slow-motion drying rack. I could still read the labels on the banana peels. The core of the pile was lukewarm at best. If I had sifted it, I might have gotten a bucket or two of usable material from the very bottom where the earthworms had done their work. But the rest was nowhere near ready. These methods work if your timeline is infinite. If you don't care if you get soil this year or next year, they are fine. But for a gardener who needs to fill beds for spring planting, the cold method is not a system. It is a storage solution. Next, I moved on to the mechanical solutions. These are the methods that promise to replace patience with hardware or hard labor. I started with the compost tumbler. You have seen these in every garden catalog. Big plastic drums on a metal stand that spin with a crank. The sales pitch is seductive. No more back-breaking turning with a pitchfork. Just give it a spin every time you walk by, and you will have fresh compost in weeks. I bought a dual-chamber model, thinking I could have one side cooking while I filled the other. But the reality was frustrating. Because the drum is elevated, it is completely cut off from the ground. No worms can get in. No beneficial fungi can migrate up from the soil. You are entirely responsible for the biology inside that plastic bubble. I found that in the summer, it baked the contents into hard, dry balls that looked like horse manure but were really just dried grass and paper. In the winter, it froze solid because it had no thermal mass. It turns the materials, yes, but tumbling alone isn't composting. It just mixes the mess. Then I tried trench composting. This is the oldest method in the book. You dig a hole in your garden bed, bury your kitchen scraps directly in the soil, and cover them up. In theory, this is brilliant. It happens right where the plants need it, and there is no pile to manage. I took a shovel and buried a week's worth of scraps between my tomato rows. The problem wasn't the science, it was the disruption. Every time I wanted to add material, I had to disturb the soil structure I had been working so hard to build. I was slicing through feeder roots and waking up dormant weed seeds. And once it's buried, you have no idea what is happening down there. You can't check the temperature. You can't adjust the moisture. You are flying blind. When I dug one spot up a few months later to check, I found the scraps preserved almost perfectly in the cool, dark clay. It solves the problem of where to put the waste, but it doesn't solve the problem of creating a harvestable resource you can control. It is waste disposal, not soil production. Then there are the specialists. These are the systems that feel more like laboratory science than gardening, bokashi and vermicomposting. I tested both, and while they are fascinating, they solve a different problem than the one I had. Bokashi is an anaerobic fermentation process. You put your scraps into an airtight bucket, sprinkle them with inoculated bran, and squash it all down. It is surprisingly effective for things you are told never to compost, like meat, dairy, and cooked leftovers. Inside that bucket, the waste doesn't rot, it pickles. It preserves the nutrients perfectly. But here is the catch that the brochures don't emphasize. When you open the bucket 2 weeks later, you don't have soil. You have fermented garbage that smells like strong cider. You still have to go outside, dig a trench, and bury this pickled mass so the soil biology can finish the job. It is a two-step process. It creates a nutrient-rich amendment, but it does not create volume. You cannot put your autumn leaves or your pulled weeds into a 5-gallon bucket. It is a kitchen solution, not a garden solution. Vermicomposting, or worm farming, was the most rewarding test on a personal level. I bought a pound of red wiggler worms and set them up in a tiered tray system in the garage. These worms are incredible workers. They turn vegetable scraps into black gold. Worm castings, which is arguably the best fertilizer on earth. The texture is perfect and the biology is dense. But worms are not machines. They are livestock. They have specific dietary needs. They don't like onions, they hate citrus, and they can't handle big temperature swings. If you feed them too much at once, the bin sours and the worms try to escape. But the biggest limitation is simply scale. A healthy worm bin might process a few pounds of scraps a week. A family garden produces hundreds of pounds of waste in a season. The worms are a fantastic supplement to a potting mix, creating a high-value fertilizer for your seed starts, but they cannot handle the bulk biomass of a homestead. They are the vitamins, not the meal. Relying on them to process everything is like trying to mow a hayfield with a pair of scissors. This brings us to the breakthrough. The method that didn't just work, but worked so fast it felt like a magic trick. It is often called the Berkeley method, or simply hot composting. If the cold pile is a slow cooker that you forgot to plug in, this is a blast furnace. The fundamental shift here is moving from a passive storage mindset to an active management mindset. You are not throwing waste away. You are building a biological reactor. The secret isn't a special chemical. It is mass and math. To make this work, you cannot trickle scraps into the pile day by day. You must build the entire system at once, like baking a cake. You need volume, at least 1 cubic yard, which is roughly the size of a washing machine. This size is critical because the pile needs to be large enough to insulate its own core, trapping the heat that the bacteria generate as they work. If the pile is too small, the heat escapes and the engine stalls. I used a simple ratio to fuel this engine. Roughly 2 buckets of browns, dried leaves, shredded cardboard, or wood chips for every 1 bucket of greens, grass clippings, kitchen scraps, or coffee grounds. You mix these ingredients thoroughly, like tossing a giant salad, ensuring there are no pockets of just leaves or just grass. As you build it, you water it. You want the material to feel exactly like a wrung-out sponge, damp to the touch, but not dripping. For the first 4 days, you do absolutely nothing. You let the biology wake up. The bacteria consume the easy sugars and rapidly multiply, generating heat as a byproduct. By day 4, if you stick your hand into the center of the pile, it won't just be warm, it will be hot. Uncomfortably hot. Somewhere between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. On a cool morning, you will see steam rising from the top like a living thing. This heat is the worker. It sterilizes weed seeds, kills pathogens, and breaks down tough fibers that cold piles can't touch. On day 5, the work begins. You turn the pile. You take the cool material from the outside edges and shovel it into the center, effectively feeding the fire. This introduces a massive blast of oxygen, which kicks the aerobic bacteria into overdrive. You repeat this process every 2 days. Day 7, turn. Day 9, turn. Day 11, turn. By day 12, the transformation is absolute. The identifiable leaves, the banana peels, and the grass clippings are gone. In their place is a dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling material that looks like 70% dark chocolate. You will often see fine white threads running through it, actinobacteria, which are the sign of a healthy high-heat burn. In less than 2 weeks, I created more high-quality soil amendment than my cold bin produced in an entire year. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't magic. It was simply creating the perfect environment for nature to do what it does best, at maximum speed. Now, you might be looking at that 12-day timeline and thinking that turning a pile every 48 hours sounds like a second job. But the reality is exactly the opposite. The hot method is actually less total work than the lazy method. It just concentrates that work into a window you can control. When you rely on a passive bin, you are constantly managing it, adding a little bit every day, wondering why it smells, stirring it occasionally, and dealing with the pests that show up because the food scraps are rotting slowly. It is a low-level annoyance that lasts for months. The hot system is a project. You block out 2 weeks, you execute the plan, and then you are done. You have finished compost and you can walk away. To make this work in a real life, you have to change how you collect your materials. This was the hardest habit for me to break. We are trained to treat the compost bin like a trash can. We walk out after dinner with a small bowl of peelings and dump it on the pile. That is the trickle method, and it is the enemy of heat. If you add cool material to a hot pile, you quench the fire. To get that reaction we saw in the 12-day test, you need to switch to a batch mindset. You don't bake 1 cookie at a time, you mix the whole bowl of dough. Composting is no different. I started stockpiling my browns, the dry leaves and shredded cardboard in a dedicated holding area. They don't rot, so they can sit there indefinitely. The greens are the bottleneck because they spoil. I stopped running out to the pile every night. Instead, I keep a 5-gallon bucket with a tight lid in the garage for kitchen scraps. And I wait. I wait until I mow the lawn, which gives me a massive infusion of fresh nitrogen. That is my trigger. On Saturday morning, I have my dry browns, my bucket of accumulated kitchen scraps, and my fresh grass clippings. I build the entire pile in 1 hour. I water it, I cover it, and the clock starts. This rhythm changes your relationship with the garden. You stop feeling guilty about the daily scraps and start seeing them as ingredients you are saving for a specific recipe. It allows you to plan your soil production around your planting schedule. If I know I am putting tomatoes in the ground on May 15th, I start a pile on May 1st. I am not hoping nature cooperates. I am scheduling a delivery. It turns composting from a vague chore into a predictable manufacturing process, and that predictability is the only thing that matters when you are trying to feed a family. While the 12-day method is impressive, I want to be clear about something important. We are not racing. The goal of a homestead is not to set speed records. The goal is to create stability. The reason I tested these methods wasn't just to see which one crossed the finish line first. It was to find the one that gave me control over the outcome. When you know you can create finished soil in 2 or 3 weeks, you stop worrying about whether nature is going to cooperate with your planting schedule. You are no longer crossing your fingers and hoping the pile at the bottom of the garden has broken down enough to use. You know it will be there because you made it happen. If life gets in the way and you miss a turn, the system doesn't fail. Maybe the pile cools down a little. Maybe it takes 18 days instead of 12. Maybe it takes 3 weeks. That is perfectly fine. The magic isn't in the specific number of days. It is in the reliability of the process. Even a failed hot pile that takes a month is still 5 months faster than the passive bin that turns into sludge. This speed gives you a buffer. It allows you to decouple your waste disposal from your soil needs. You aren't scrambling to find fertility the day you plant your peppers. You are building a reserve. Think of this system as a soil bank. When you use the passive method, you are living paycheck to paycheck with your fertility. You are constantly waiting for a deposit that might not clear in time for spring. But with the rapid batch method, you are making large, deliberate deposits into your savings account. You build a pile in the fall when the leaves drop. You cook it down in a few weeks. Then you cover it and let it cure through the winter. It sits there, protected and stable, improving with age. When spring arrives, you don't have to rush to the garden center to buy plastic bags of compost. You simply walk out to your holding area, pull back the tarp, and withdraw exactly what you need. This predictability changes how you feel about your garden. It removes the anxiety of scarcity. You stop looking at your soil as a problem you have to solve every single year and start seeing it as a resource you manage. You are not dependent on the supply chain, and you are not dependent on the weather breaking down your leaves for you. You have taken a natural cycle that usually happens on a forest floor over a decade, and you have condensed it into a rhythm that fits a human life. That is the real payoff. It isn't just about saving money on fertilizer, though you will do that. It is about the quiet confidence of knowing that no matter what happens in the world or the market, you have the ability to feed your own land. It is easy to watch a comparison like this and feel like you need a laboratory in your backyard to get started. You might think you need to buy a specific tumbler, build a 3-bay timber system, or order special worms before you can even begin. Please do not do that. I tested these 6 methods so you would not have to. You do not need a worm farm, and you do not need expensive plastic equipment to make soil. The tools are not the system. The biology is the system. My advice is to stop overthinking the equipment and start small. You do not need to overhaul your entire life this weekend. Just pick one corner of your yard that is out of the way. Gather your dry leaves or cardboard. Save your kitchen scraps in a bucket until you have enough for a single batch. Then, build one pile. Just one. Do not worry about getting the carbon to nitrogen ratios perfect the first time. Do not worry if it takes 3 weeks instead of 12 days. The goal is not to become a compost scientist. The goal is to become a producer. You are simply trying to close the loop on your own property. When you finally hold that first handful of dark finished earth that you created from your own waste, the feeling is distinct. It is the quiet satisfaction of knowing you are a little less dependent on the store than you were yesterday. You have everything you need right now. You just have to let the system work.